Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to talk today about is there a data barrier to entry? But before I begin that talk, I want to correct one thing that was said earlier this morning. And it was said that in order to remove yourself from Google News, you must remove yourself from Google Search. That's 180 degrees wrong. It's completely the opposite. And it's very easy to check this. I went and typed in remove content from Google News, and I got answer 93977, and it says down there at the bottom, if you block access to googlebot.news, your content won't appear in Google News, and if you block access to content, then you won't appear in search or news. So you can remove yourself from news without removing yourself from search. You can remove it temporally. You can say, I want to remove for this day or for this week. You can remove it by page, article by article. I believe you can remove it even paragraph by paragraph, so it's certainly possible to do that, and it's been that way for a long, long time. It's very easy to find. I don't know how this misunderstanding could arise. The only thing I can think of is that this page could not be found by Bing. That's the only thing I can think of. But I could be wrong on that too. All right, so now to talk about, give you a little outline. I want to talk about this idea of Google data barrier to entry. Sorry, the data barrier to entry, that dates back to around 2007. When I first saw it, it was in the context of the FTC investigation. What does it mean? What matters? And my premise is that it isn't the data that counts, it's what you do with the data. I want to talk a bit about network effects. We heard a little bit about that this morning. I want to talk about supply side and demand side returns to scale. And then I'm going to use as my example this online search. So how much data is enough to do a capable job in online search? And finally, I'll talk about learning by doing. Okay, so many of us know that there are two kinds of economies of scale that economists talk about. One is the demand side, which is network effects. And there it affects value. So it says the value of adopting a service to an incremental user is larger the more users have already adopted. So it says it's more valuable to join this social network if there are a lot of people on this social network. And then there's the older idea, the idea of supply-side economies of scale, which is the cost of producing an incremental unit is smaller the higher the level of output. And you can think of an incremental unit in terms of quantity, or you could think in terms of quality if you want to. And then there's a related idea, the economy of scope, which says the cost of producing an incremental unit is smaller when there's other related production that takes place. So there's two important ideas, the demand side economies of scale, the supply side economies of scale. First one's often referred to as network effects. And it has been claimed that there's demand side economies of scale in search because advertisers want to be with their lot of users. But then the second premise seems a little funny because users normally don't want to be where there are lots of ads. Typically, you don't get this positive feedback going because even though advertisers want to be where users are, users don't necessarily want to be where there are a lot of ads. And this whole idea of demand-side economies of scale in the search context is pretty suspect. But there could be, potentially, it's possible, logically possible, there could be economies of scale. Now, these two ideas, demand-side and supply-side economies of scale, could both show up in a single service. For example, think of Facebook, or for that matter, any social network. If there are more users on Facebook than on MySpace, then a new user might prefer to adopt Facebook because more of their friends might be there. Possible. And then there's also the supply-side economies of scale could happen. If there are more users on Facebook than on MySpace, maybe the cost of adding an additional user is lower in one than the other. Well, maybe, maybe not. It's an empirical question of whether that's true. Now, it's important to understand that for these adoption decisions, do I want to go with this product or with that product, what matters is share, right? You want to know the relative share. Is one twice as big as the other? Is one 3 times as big as the other? And so on. But when you're looking on the supply side, about the cost side or the quality side, then what matters is raw size. So if one is twice as big as the other, it doesn't necessarily mean anything at all. It could be that both of them could easily coexist. They just have potentially different costs. So pure economies of scale mean bigger network has lower unit cost of the firm. You don't have to be the most profitable engine to survive. You just have to be profitable in the sense of not making ongoing losses. So there are plenty of upsets. MySpace upsetting Facebook, upsetting MySpace, Google upsetting Yahoo and AltaVista and Lycos and all these other search engines. So they were the new kid in the block at one point, and they succeeded because they had a better product. So it's possible, in fact, I would say tempting for people to think of these economies of scale on demand side or supply side as being insurmountable. Well, you just have to look at history to see that they aren't at all insurmountable. And in fact, there are also diseconomies of scale. For example, there's congestion. It may be that a user doesn't want to be where there are a lot of ads, as I mentioned earlier, or it could be just competing priorities within an organization. So, for example, Microsoft tends to put a lot of resources into Windows and Office because those are part of its core business, and Bing is somewhat secondary. I'll talk about just how secondary it is in a few minutes. Google, but in contrast, prioritizes search and ads. Those are our core business, and maybe Google Docs is somewhat secondary. So a Me Too approach that says, well, I'm going to just reproduce what you have done in Docs, or Bing says, I'm just going to reproduce what you've done in search, that's really futile. What matters is try to produce a differentiated product because there's no real strategic goal in simply producing more of the same. And of course, consumers have benefited hugely from this competition because there are now many, many free services, not just search, but also Docs and email, Gmail, Hotmail, etc., that provide free services to consumers. Now, see if that shows up. Yes. In some of these documents that you see discussing economies of scale in the search business, you see a little picture like this that says more users, that leads to more chances to show ads, that leads to more search data, that allows you to do better targeting, thereby you get more advertisers, and then you get higher revenue and more ads sold, and then you've got more revenue to invest in infrastructure and syndication, and that gives you more users. So the idea is you have this virtuous cycle that illustrates this positive feedback I was alluding to before. But actually, that cycle is there in lots of businesses. Look at the magazine business. You have more readers, so you have more chances to show ads. So you have more ways to do targeted ads to individual interests. You have more advertisers, you have higher revenue, and you have more revenue so you can invest in producing better content. So there's no difference between that medium and the search medium. You're using the information that you can gather about your readers or your consumers to create content that's more compelling to readers and consumers, and therefore generate revenue by which you can attract more readers and consumers. Now, we heard this talk earlier about the newspaper business. If only the newspaper business had looked at that chart, they'd know how to make money. You just run around that cycle a few times and then everything would be great. So it can't be that easy, but according to the critics, or people who say that network effects or returns to scale are hugely important, that's the story that they're pitching to you. And in fact, it doesn't even have to be a media business. So look, for example, at the hamburger business. So it's the same way with hamburgers. You have more customers. And then if you have more customers, you have a chance to sell more burgers. And if you sell more burgers, you learn more about what people like and what they want to buy. And you can produce a product that's more attuned to your market, thereby making higher revenue, and that revenue can be invested in product and customers, and you get more customers, you just keep going around, and you've got better and better burgers. In fact, I tend to call this little cycle not the virtuous cycle, but in fact, the burger cycle. Because you can see exactly how to build a profitable business, just follow that loop around and around, and profits keep coming up. Now, of course, you sometimes see this stated verbally. The higher the number of advertisers using an online search engine, the higher the revenue of the general search engine, and that revenue can be reinvested in maintenance improvement of the general search service so as to attract more users. Boy, that sounds easy, doesn't it? So let's look at what's important there. You're saying the higher the number of advertisers, the higher the revenue, and the higher the revenue, the more money you can plow back into making an even better search engine. But substitute. The more customers a business has, the higher the revenue of the business, revenue which can be reinvested in the maintenance and improvement of the business so as to attract more customers. Why bother to get an MBA? Right there tells you how to run a business. Just invest, get more customers, you get more money, invest in the business and get more customers. So this whole business about these demand-side economies of scale and network effects is just circular. I mean, it's circular in the diagram and it's circular in the language. It's really trivial because it's completely ignoring the cost side of the business. In fact, look at the other side, at the cost side. The higher the number of customers, the more you have to invest to support those customers. And the higher the costs are that have to be invested, you have to devote these costs to the maintenance and improvement of the business if it's to serve a higher number of customers. So of course what matters is not whether you've got positive returns in demand side and supply side. What matters, of course, is how the costs and revenues both increase as scale increases. Because if you decrease your scale, it's going to cost you more, and it may or may not improve revenue. It kind of depends on whether there are some sources of positive feedback, which there often could be. What matters is a comparison between the revenue side and the cost side. So the whole debate or discussion over these economies of scale is based on examining one side of the market in a hypothetical way, claiming that you can in fact improve your product by plowing this revenue back in. It's not that simple. It requires something in terms of effort or cost to achieve the benefits you get from having potentially more information. So, by the way, it reminds me of this statement. You know, it's sometimes said the only thing that's more dangerous than an economist is an amateur economist. And if you look at these statements, you see a lot of amateur economics going on. Okay, so let's look now at the serious question. The question is, are there supply-side economies of scale? In this case, economies of scale that are related to data. And of course, more is better. That is, you can always throw data away. You don't have to use it, so we would not expect true diseconomies. But in general, we would expect diminishing returns from data, just as with any other factor of production. For example, if you look at it from a statistical point of view, the standard errors go down as the square root of sample size. So if you're 4 times as large, you're only twice as accurate in terms of the standard errors. And I've heard it said, it's been claimed that, well, yeah, that's true for that old-fashioned statistics, but what about machine learning? Machine learning doesn't necessarily have this diseconomies of scale I was referring to a moment ago. So I went and looked at the literature, and there's a lot of literature out there that shows how accuracy of machine learning methods depends on data size. This is an early paper by Banco and Brill from Microsoft Research, and you can see very clearly down on the bottom they have millions of observations, in this case words. On the top they have accuracy, and indeed you tend to see the diminishing marginal returns just as you would with any other factor. Here's another example, voting among classifiers. We use a number of different classifiers, and they have a technique to aggregate those. Again, more data is typically better, but you see it's subject to diminishing returns to scale as with any other factor. Here's another example from Netflix. This was a real case scenario of an algorithm. Adding more than 2 million training examples had little to no effect. Here's an example from a thesis a student wrote comparing different methods in terms of how the accuracy of the classifiers increased as you increase the number of observations. And here's an example from a recent paper, 2013, called Predictive Modeling with Big Data, Is Bigger Really Better? And you see in most of those cases you have diminishing returns. Up there in the upper right it looks like you don't, but there's only 2 to the 14th observations, which is only 16,000 observations, so you're still on the increasing part of the curve. And I think there's one other example, yeah, down there on the middle example in the bottom row, which is 2 to the 18th, which is about 256,000 observations. So again, if you're looking at these diminishing returns to scale, they're prevalent in almost every example. In fact, almost every example I've looked at that has any reasonable size whatsoever. This is a quote from the paper. As Figure 2 shows, for most of the data sets, performance keeps improving, even when there's a sample of millions of individuals or training models. However, the curves do exhibit diminishing returns to scale, just as an economist would expect. This is a little schematic picture from Peter Norvig, who is the chief scientist at Google. And he argues that typically you'll see small returns from machine learning. You hit a rising sector, and then you level off or asymptote to a particular level after you've exploited those economies of scale in the growing part of the curve. So the real question is not what things look like in theory or what things look like in general, but what they look like for this specific case that we're concerned with, namely, where is Google on this chart? Where's Microsoft on this chart? Are they in the region where more data is really helpful, or have you hit the point where the data is pretty much, the returns to the data is pretty much leveled off? So we hear that if Bing were bigger, it would be better. But of course, if Bing were better, it would likely be bigger. So there is this question about which way the causality goes. How do you get bigger? Well, I've coined a little statement there. Imitation is the sincerest form of strategy. But of course, is Me Too really a strategy? And in fact, let's look at that. Here's a picture. I searched for Rome. Is that Bing or Google? Let's look at a different one. Is that Bing or Google? Okay. Well, it turns out this one is Bing, and this one is Google. Okay? But you can hardly tell the difference. Why? Because Google has produced a format for its content, and I think Bing has said, we don't really want to do anything new. We're just going to try to do something as close as possible to what Google has done, and so they've created this kind of Me Too web page. And in fact, it's not, when you look at the history, Bing started out as a beta version in 2010 in Germany, came out of beta in January 2012. Google first offered its German version in 2000, 10 years earlier. And in 2007, we started our 40 language initiative where every product had to be available in 40 languages within 90 days of its being launched. So this led to versions for European market in the early 2000s. So it's not all that surprising that we've ended up with a large share of queries in Europe because we've been operating in Europe for a far, far longer time, and in fact pushed the global expansion from a very early stage. Now, Bing handles about half as many queries per day as Google does in the US, and what that means is to get comparable sample sizes, you have to run your experiments at a 2% size rather than a 1% experiment. Many of our experiments at Google are done at 1% or 0.5% size, and so Bing would have to do it twice as big. Or you could run the same size experiment, but run it for 2 days rather than 1 day, or for 3 days rather than a day and a half. So you could do a little bit longer experiment. Or you could set things up to the amount of easily accessible past data is 4 weeks rather than 2 weeks. At Google, we've got the last 2 weeks of data stuck in basically in a database where you can query it using SQL, and a lot of the analysis is done just using those last 2 weeks. If you want to go back and look at the logs, you can do that as well, but the question is how much data do you want easily and readily accessible? And 4 weeks of data on Bing is pretty much equivalent to 2 weeks of data on Google. So the question is there some magic threshold that if you can just get by that threshold, then suddenly life becomes much, much easier? Well, one of the statements we saw was that Bing said that 50% of queries are seen by Bing fewer than 100 times a month. So it's really hard to work with that when you only see half your queries, you only see less than 100 times a month. Well, we ran the numbers on Google. It's exactly the same. 50% of the queries are seen less than 100 times in a month. And if you look at the fraction of queries that are never seen before, so we'll look first at total queries. In November 2008, 16% of the queries were never seen before. And in November of 2014, 15% of the queries were never seen before. So the fraction of queries never seen before has not changed in that 7 years. Distinct queries, okay, so a query would be Kim Kardashian. A query might occur 50,000 times a day, but that's one distinct query, okay? So if we look at one distinct query, November of 2008, it was about 38%, and if you see in that, November of 2008, it was 38%, and that pretty much hit an asymptote back there in 2005. So that number really hasn't changed in 7 years. So because the number of queries never seen before has been constant for at least 7 years, the question is not whether you have more data or not, but whether you're able to apply more powerful algorithms to the data that you do have. And that's no different between Bing and Google as far as we can tell. So here's a little example to illustrate that. Back in September of 2008, Danny Sullivan, who's the editor of Search Engine Land, wrote an article on Yahoo's poor ad targeting. And this was at the time when Yahoo and Google wanted to have a joint venture in terms of Google supplying the search results for Yahoo. That was later shot down by the FTC. But Yahoo executive Hillary Schneider showed why they needed to make this partnership. And she showed that by doing a search on red roses in Birmingham, Alabama. Okay, that's the term in brackets, red roses in Birmingham, Alabama. And she found that Google showed a full page of ads for that query, and Yahoo showed no ads whatsoever for that query. But then Danny Sullivan went on to dig into this a little bit, and he discovered that, in fact, all of the advertisers who were on Google, all but one, were actually also advertisers on Yahoo. It was just that given the query, red roses in Birmingham, Alabama, Yahoo was unable to find the ads that were relevant to that query. And as he ended up in the last sentence of his article, he said, if Yahoo can't target an ad for roses to red roses in Birmingham, Alabama, it's got serious issues. Now, I was reminded of that as preparing this paper and said, well, okay, that was Yahoo way back in ancient times in 2008, but I wonder how Bing does with that query in 2015, 7 years later. Well, let's look first at Google. So Google, we typed in red roses in Birmingham, Alabama, and we get ads from Ava's Flowers, and over there, From You Flowers, Pro Flowers, Global Rose. And it goes on down. There are 10 or 12 ads. I just showed you the top few. Let's look at Bing. Red roses in Birmingham, Alabama, 0 ads. No ads. No ads whatsoever. But let's take that Ava's Flowers. Ava Flowers, are they there on Bing? So I type in the term, Ava's Flowers. Sure enough, it's the first ad. Now, how do you tell an ad? Well, that little bitty black thing there, right in front of the green text, that says ad. So that's how you know that that's an ad. By the way, you might contrast that to how you know it's an ad here. We have this little yellow box with white text, just so you could see the difference. There's Ava's Flowers. What about the next one? That was From You Flowers. First ad up there, From You Flowers. Here's Pro Flowers. Here's Global Rose. So in fact, Bing had ads for all of those search results at Google except for 2 of them. The 2 of them were aggregators, not florists. FTD, again, there's the ad. Simply by doing search in Bing. Here's the boats. There's also the ad. So in every case, the data was there. There was no shortage of data. They had ads from these sites in the database. It's just that they could not find ads from florists for the query, red roses in Birmingham, Alabama. And in fact, it's a little strange because you type in red roses in Chicago, Illinois, or you type in red roses in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or red roses anywhere. There are no ads. There are no ads on Bing. So there's something wrong with their ad parser or their ad search mechanisms there. I don't know what it is, of course, but there's a problem in terms of the algorithm, not in terms of the data. Now, in the business, you hear a lot about long tail searches. Okay, long tail. Well, what happens is when people are comparing search engines, they'll do a search on their favorite engine, their one they use most. And if they can't find what they want, they'll try a search on other search engines. And that gives the other search engines a chance to show their stuff. So it is a dimension of competition. Then we have a difficult search. If you take an easy search, Bing or Google are going to do about the same way. It's the hard searches that matter. So you might ask yourself, well, what are the hard searches? What are the difficult searches? These are the so-called long tail searches. And people think of sort of exotic, strange things, but what we did is I went and pulled some examples of queries, commercial queries, queries that had ads attached, that only showed up in a single day. They showed up one time in a day. And here's a list of a few of those. Recover information from digital camera hard drive. My favorite is down there, number 6, cheap but good auto insurance in Los Angeles, California. So to figure out what the person is looking for there, you've got to realize that Los Angeles means Los Angeles, and you have to realize that cheap but good is pretty much irrelevant. What they want is auto insurance in Los Angeles. That's what they're looking for. And so there's lots and lots of ads for auto insurance in Los Angeles. It's just you have to recognize that that's the intent of the person who's written that query. And if you look down those queries, you see that many, many, many of them are localized. That is, they're looking for some service in a local area. So if you take a query like locksmith, locksmith is a very, very valuable query because when people want a locksmith, they want them right away. And I don't want a locksmith in Los Angeles, California. I want a locksmith in Danville, California, where I live. So that query could appear only once a day in any given location, or for that matter, only once a week or once every 2 weeks. It's a very valuable query, and of course you'd like to have good ads to show people because there's a locksmith available almost anywhere. You just have to figure out where they are. So most of these long tail queries are in fact long queries, lots of words in them. They're also often local queries, so you have to have that localization capability to really answer those queries in a flexible way. So, why is Google better in doing these things? Well, there's a nice article in the American Economic Journal from last year where they looked at some data actually in steel production, and they found that even though the technology remained exactly the same, the capital equipment was exactly the same, and the workers were similar in every respect, productivity just kept increasing until it doubled over about a 10-year period. And what they concluded was learning by experimentation or tweaking seems to be behind the continual and gradual process of productivity growth. And in my opinion, this is not Google's official opinion, but in my opinion, this is what is really going on, learning by doing. And if you've been around a long time, you learn about these bugs like red roses in Birmingham, Alabama, and you're able to tweak your algorithm so you can handle more and more cases. You understand the importance of geography and long queries. You understand all these things, you can continually improve your search engine. So search is core to Google business. We've been doing it since 1998, and during that period, we've learned a lot, and we think we produced a high-quality product. And by the way, I have to say that Microsoft has been doing operating systems and office software since 1980, and I'm sure they've learned a lot about that as well. So there is an advantage in terms of learning by doing, but it's not an insurmountable advantage at all. If you look at Microsoft, they have $80 billion in cash, potentially to invest in search. Baidu, which is the world's second biggest search engine with about 900,000 users now, going on a billion. They're investing heavily in machine learning and foreign expansion. And we firmly believe at Google that if we stopped innovating, if we just froze our system, we would see us losing users within a few months, if not a year. Now, I mentioned earlier that it was certainly possible to overcome that advantage in learning by doing, and it's interesting to look at how much Bing and Google invest in search. So in the Seattle newspaper back in 2009, Steve Ballmer said he was going to invest 5 to 10% of operating income. That turns out to be about $1 to $2 billion a year over the next decade, and that seems like a lot of money. To me, it's a lot of money. But look at Google. Google's costs are about $48 billion a year, and roughly 30% of that goes to search on ads. So that means Google is spending 10 times as much as Bing on search. Now, some of that is due to the fact that, of course, it's larger, because there are definitely costs involved, but some of it is due to the fact that it's really a core business. And the question is, how does Microsoft expect to succeed with a Me Too strategy, spending 1/10 as much as the current incumbent? I think they've shown it's possible to build a good imitation on the cheap by spending only a few $1 billion a year, but how do they expect to actually succeed in this market by spending such a small amount of money on such a product which is so much a Me Too product? And we face the same problem, of course. We face the problem in terms of office software. There's a very strong incumbent out there, so how should you compete? Well, you don't want to compete by building a clone of Microsoft Office. What you want to do is you want to compete by building a capability that offers different functionality, and that's what we've done with the Google Docs suite. And it's been very popular because of that. It offers something different, offers something new. And in my final remarks, I want to say a word or two about product listing ads. And the reason I want to talk about product listing ads is this is an important issue in terms of the European Competition Commission case. So if you look at the statement of objections, which has been released a week ago and leaked in about a half hour, so it's not so hard to find. You know, Mark Twain once said, two can keep a secret if one of them's dead. But when you release a report to 32 people, it's not too surprising that it gets out to the press rather quickly. The entire issue in that statement of objections has to do with those 4 running shoes on the top of the page. Because if you look at the Google page, you've got ads. Those are AdWords ads. Remember, those have the yellow tag next to them. And then we have this other kind of ad called product listing ads. And with product listing ads, the merchants send in pictures, prices, and short descriptions of their products, and we show a little glimpse of those products in picture form in the ad section of the page, right up on top of the page where all the other ads are. And it says clearly there that those are sponsored results. And if you click on that shop to buy running shoes on Google, you're taken to Google Shopping where you examine more pages. All right? So that's the whole crux of the matter. The crux of the matter is whether it's appropriate for Google to show those kinds of picture ads at the top of the page where all the other ads are. All right? That's what the debate is. And of course, we believe it is appropriate to show that because we want them to be in the space where ads normally occur. And our advertisers want their ads to be featured prominently. So just like the back cover of a magazine is a very prominent position, and advertisers are willing to pay to be featured on that back cover, we think that this is a very prominent position, and we're offering that to advertisers. It's sold by an auction like all our other ads, and it's a question of whether that's an appropriate use of that space. That's what the issue is about. Now, it is interesting to look at this page, which is from Bing, and this is called Bing product ads. And you notice it's exactly the same. There are ads up there, textual ads. Over here are ads using their product listing format. So I understand this point about dominance, but you could hardly argue that this is an abuse of dominance when even a non-dominant firm would do exactly the same thing because it's in the economic interest of the party to sell those ads and those positions to advertisers in order to support the whole business enterprise of the generation of content. And in fact, Microsoft's quite explicit about it. If you go to their product listing ads, here's this little box which I circled in red. If you're already running Google product listing ads, it's easy to import those campaigns into Bing. Once you're set up, they're easy to manage and maintain. And in fact, Google has done a kind of service to this industry because we've specified a standard schema for uploading information about products, and everybody who wants to have a comparative shopping service essentially accepts that stream. So the costs of entry into that business have become very low because once you've prepared, you, the merchant, has prepared your listing of ads that you want to upload to the search engine, you can upload it to any number of search engines you want. And because of this low cost of entry, there are actually dozens of new comparison shopping services that have entered into the market every year for the past decade. And you can verify that very easily. There are hundreds of them. By the way, here's Yahoo product ads. Looks the same way because they can use the same data feed from Bing. And this is their little blurb about why it makes sense to have those picture ads. And here's Baidu product ads, which are a little unique because they not only have the pictures of the product over there on the right, they also have the logos of the products as well. So in fact, the industry standard behavior is in fact to show these picture product ads because merchants like them and because users like them. And they're always positioned in every search engine at the top of the page because they're trying to put the shopping ads in with the other ads, the textual ads, so as not to confuse the user about the difference between organic search results and the ads. I'll skip that one. Oh, yeah, I think I'll skip that. This is just a point about other sources of data. Microsoft VP Durkoy indicates that, well, you know, we've got a lot of data from the operating systems too, and you can use that in terms of providing better search because actually everything the user does on the computer system, irrespective of what browser they use, is accessible by the operating system which Microsoft controls. So I'm not worried about Microsoft having too little data. The challenge is whether they have the expertise and able to exploit that data effectively in their competition with Google. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal.